Welcome back to another episode of Geek Warning, everybody. It's Tuesday, March 21st. It'll be the 22nd by the time you listen to this podcast. We got a great show for you today. We're not live today. We decided we're gonna dial back the live shows just a little bit to make some space for some of the other podcasts that we're producing. I think Wheel Talk is going to be live this week. I think it's going to be actually a live show at the end of Get Welcome, which is going to be pretty cool. So it's just the three of us today. How are you, Dave Rum?
I'm well. I'm very well. Had a large article go up, so I'm feeling a little sense of relief now. So thank you.
6,000 words about the new SRAM mountain bike drivetrains that have murdered, in your own words, the derailleur hanger. So we're going to talk. Obviously, we're going to talk about that a little bit later. There is a deep dive podcast you did with somebody from SRAM already up on the channel. So if you haven't caught that, go catch that. But we're gonna dive into it, just the three of us here. Ronan, how are you today?
Good. Well, tired, is that maybe the right word? I spent the entire day trying to get through Dave's review of the new SRAM stuff. So 3 or 4 sittings. At one stage, I almost reached for a caffeine gel, but I put the iPad down. I'll come back to it later once we finish this pod.
My goal with working at Escape Collective is just to create content that consumes the lives of everyone else that works at Escape Collective.
It's all we do is we just edit Dave's stuff. We got like 8 people on staff, just ready and waiting at any given moment.
And that was the brief version. You should have seen what I cut. I mean, wow.
Of course. I enjoyed some of the comments that popped up and people appreciating the fact that, well, because of the way that our model works and the way that we are funded, they felt like they could sort of truly believe everything that you had written, which was pretty cool. And like, I think historically, all of us have been around the block a couple times and you know, I don't think that actually, I know that piece isn't any different than anything you would have written throughout your entire career, but isn't it kind of nice to not be questioned because of the model shift? I think that's really nice.
Yeah, it certainly is a relief to not have to justify that I am independent. But I saw one question come up about the podcast and the podcast I did with Lachlan Mc Laughlin from SRAM about whether that's sponsored content, and it's not. We will be doing deep dives on the Geek Warning channel from time to time, especially when large product releases come our way or come the way of the industry. And when we have the opportunity to speak to representatives of the brand for a proper deep dive, we will take that opportunity. And none of that's going to be sponsored. And if you ever hear sponsored content from us, you'll know it's sponsored content because we will very clearly tell you it is. So yeah, that's something you can expect more of with large product releases. But just know that was purely because we thought it was interesting, not because we're getting money for it.
We actually haven't taken a single dollar of ad spend, ad revenue thus far, and that isn't to say that we never will. We've said this a number of different times, but we're not anti-advertising, and it's more that we're anti like sneaky advertising and also anti-annoying advertising. Those two things, like annoying pop-up ads or things that pretend to be editorial that actually aren't, not into those things. But yeah, I mean, like there's going to be ads on podcasts and things like that in the future. Probably not on this podcast, but on placeholders on Pretty Serious Bike Racing, on Wheel Talk, definitely have ads on all those. But yeah, not a single dollar so far. So you can, everyone out there can rest assured that every single word that Dave Rome put in his 6,000 word piece on this new SRAM was just straight out of his own head and his own analysis and his own opinion, which kind of brings us to a bit of self-promotion. Dave, what are we asking people to do?
We really want people to subscribe to escapecollective.cc. It's how we're funded. It's how all three of us and James, who's about to join the pod when he comes off his little time off, and and everyone else a part of the team. It's how we are getting paid, and it's how we're making our livelihood happen. And without your subscriptions, this doesn't continue.
I think the other big point here, beyond the fact that obviously if people don't sign up, then we don't get paid, but the sort of bigger point for all of you out there is that signing up means that you get what you want and essentially what you're paying for, right? Because if you sign up, then we can continue to make the stuff that you're asking for. That's the beauty of the model that we're working under. It's been, I think, very obvious over sort of the first weekend that we've existed, and extremely obvious in Dave's SRAM piece this morning, is that you get what you are asking for, which is depth, not breadth, which is honesty, which is a site that you can absolutely trust, which is a huge deal on the tech side. You get all these things for your membership. That's the big push here.
That's a much better pitch than me just saying I need money to buy tools.
Both are true,
but
I mean, the thing is, it's two different ways of saying the same thing, Dave. Like, if people don't sign up, then none of us have jobs. Also, if people don't sign up, none of this exists. This podcast doesn't exist. Placeholders doesn't exist. The entire site doesn't exist. We go back to, you have to get your cycling and tech news from places that want to bombard you with pop-up ads. So that's not fun.
Mm-hmm.
The other side of it that non-members may not have seen is just the whole community that's sort of developed since we launched this thing, especially within the Discord. I didn't really realize until this setup that I've had Discord for about 4 years apparently, or since the pandemic anyway. I must try it out on Zwift or something. Never used it. Never was part of any other communities. Never clicked on the app. And now I can't put it down because the chat that's going on between our members within that Discord group is just fascinating. There's always something else you want to dive into. There's always a conversation you want to be part of. And I described it to someone the other day as it's like the internet without any of the nastiness. And that's kind of what the community is. It's just like
good description.
It's the cycling internet without any of the nastiness, which I really like.
Yeah. The only thing I'll add is that Caley mentioned depth, not breadth. And I think that's a very key point, is that this SRAM piece is a good example of areas that we'd like to expand into, but we're not staffed for at the moment. James and myself are very well versed in the mountain bike sphere, but we want to do mountain biking properly, and we need more members in order to make that happen. At the moment, we're staffed well for the road side. We're not staffed to cover the mountain bike side the way we want to, and that'll come with membership. So for me, that's an exciting thing, and that's something I'm going to keep pushing for, because more members that come my way, the closer I can get to having the content that I really want as well. So there's that.
Yeah, and we don't want to sort of move into those spaces until we can really do it properly, right? So you're going to get the occasional piece like what Dave wrote this morning, frankly, because that, the new SRAM stuff probably has implications well beyond mountain biking is the other reason.
Absolutely.
We wanted to run that. But for us to do, to drop into mountain biking or drop into bike packing or whatever, we need more resources. And because we want to be able to do it properly, because again, that's what you're expecting. That's what you're paying for. If we can't do it properly, then what's the point? Because if we're gonna half-ass mountain bike, why would you give us $100 for it? Right. So we have to be able to sort of go all the way. And we essentially have sort of revenue or membership triggers for that sort of thing. That's the way that this whole thing is going to work. So anyway, this is a bit rambly version of us telling you to sign up. Head to escapecollective.cc. Sign up if you haven't already. We all appreciate it. Like, genuine thanks. It's also, I think, the best. It's an investment in the content that you want to see. Otherwise, we wouldn't be trying this. So, fellas, we have a fair number of things to talk about today. We've got some broken Bianchi bar, something we never want to be talking about, but unfortunately, I think we have to talk about a little bit today. We've got a bit of MSR tech, Milan Sanremo tech. We've got a dirty Dave, of course, because it's my favorite thing to say. We are going to talk a little bit more about overstock and clearance sales and the industry glut that appears to be here. And then we've got a few things that are on our mind and over the heads of our family. And of course, we've got a PSA for you today.
That's a lot.
That's a lot. Well, we always sort of list these things in the beginning, and sometimes we don't actually get to some of them. And I don't, people sometimes notice, they're like, you said you were going to talk about this thing, and then you never did. And it's just because we went too long and something else. So maybe that'll happen again today. I don't know. Anyway, I had Mal edit out a lot of that from last week's episode from your intro. So a lot of people don't know. But anyone that had tuned into the live audience would have been like, what? Where's half the episode that you promised? Yeah, that happens somewhat more often than not, I would say. Yeah. So let's start with a somewhat unfortunate topic. Two different sets of broken Bianchi bars. This was from two different crashes, if I remember correctly. Ronan, what exactly are we talking about here? I mean, broken bars are always a scary thing. So let's
we're talking about Hugo Hofstetter, who rides for Arkea Samsic, was racing in the Grand Prix de Nantes in France last week. It's a race that used to be a sprinter's race, but a few years ago they threw in a heck of a lot of cobbled sections into it. So it's now almost like a mini Paris-Roubaix, and actually includes a few sectors that are identical to those used in Paris-Roubaix. So it's a very challenging race. Yeah, pretty much. And Hofstetter was actually, I think he was sort of one of the favourites, or perhaps an outside favourite coming into the race. French rider, rides for a French team. And what has become a big race. So I think it was with about 50 kilometers to go, he was involved in a crash, and I actually seen that one. And after the crash, he was chasing back on, and I didn't know I was kind of watching it on iPad. I was in the workshop doing something, and I didn't know for sure if I was imagining it or if it was because it was on iPad or what. But it looked like his lever was vibrating on the cobbles more than his handlebar was, or it just looked out of sync, his lever. And then all of a sudden the camera cut back to him, and his handlebar, the non-drive side of his handlebar, was dangling and was only held in place with the brake hose from the lever to the brake caliper. So yeah, he suffered a broken handlebar in the crash. Not abnormal for a handlebar to break, especially with, let's assume he crashed at pace with some sort of force on to cobblestones with carbon handlebars. It's not out of the ordinary that they might break in that scenario. I think he's probably counted himself lucky that they were initially broken but not snapped, and then they snapped and he didn't crash again. So that was probably good for him. But then the camera cut back to him with about 30 kilometers to go, and apparently he had been involved in a second crash, and he had already changed to a spare bike. Obviously, he couldn't ride for 20 kilometers on a bike with half a handlebar. Although that is something I will come back to in a second. But when the camera cut back to him with about 30 kilometers to go, he had gotten on a spare bike, crashed again, apparently, and the handlebar on the spare bike had suffered the same fate on the opposite side. So the drive side of his handlebars on the spare bike had snapped also, and I mean like a complete break, dangling there by the brake hose again for anybody that hasn't seen it. And then
and this is the integrated handlebar on the new Bianchi. What's the model?
It's the new Bianchi Ultra RC it was only launched last October time, to much sort of I was going to say fanfare, but it wasn't really fanfare that it was launched to. It was launched to, I think it's maybe unfair to Bianchi, but it's fair to say it was launched to much ridicule. I took a kind of deep dive into it at the time and looked at some of the sort of claims that they were making about that bike, and I still never had a chance to ride it. But anyway, it is what it is. Arkea are riding the bike this year, and now that same bike has suffered a double handlebar failure, which, again, one, you can understand, but two, in such quick succession.
Twice as many.
Yeah. You can understand a second crash could well have been the exact same fate as the first one. High impact on carbon bars, on cobbles, but also you're kind of thinking, really? Can that happen twice in such quick succession?
So it's worth noting that Bianchi has come out. They were very quick to respond to this, and they came out with an official statement saying this was crash damage, pressures of racing, and yes, a carbon handlebar that suffers a heavy impact at a high-speed crash is probably going to be a point of failure. We know this. This is why a lot of pros have traditionally in the past chosen to use aluminium handlebars over carbon, because in the event of a crash, those bars would probably bend and they could keep racing. So I mean, this isn't necessarily a new thing, but I guess from my point of view, and maybe Ronan and yourself as well, I'm actually, I agree that it was the crash that caused these bars to break, the two separate crashes. My concern is that in both crashes, they caused the handlebars to break in the same spot, which to me shows a potential weakness in this handlebar.
So that spot was essentially right at the clamp, right?
No, it was, from what I could see, it was past the clamp. So it was kind of like just past, like if you imagine like the bend of the handlebar, it's just on the extreme of the bend. So so it's past the clamp towards the top of the
above
handlebar.
Or below? Above the clamp?
Above, as it kind of curves back to being the flat section, the straight section of the handlebar, which for me kind of makes me think that it's not too dissimilar to a lot of other carbon handlebar issues we've seen in the past, where that curvature there is actually the hardest part to get compression in the material. It's sort of a known issue, a known problem within some of the industry handlebars. I know Salsa had a recall of their handlebars for this, where basically that curve is very tight, and it can be hard to get proper compaction of the carbon there, and it is quite easy to therefore have a weak spot in that place. And I mean, this is probably wild speculation, but it's I mean, the fact that they both broke there kind of, for me, just makes me worried that there is a weak spot in that bar.
Yeah, I mean, my first thought looking at it was just like the same mechanic over torqued two different bikes, because it is close enough to that clamp that, you know, if I'm looking at the sort of all the different variables that would potentially cause this sort of thing, the fact that the bike was worked on by the same person, that's a feasible one to me. That was the first thing that popped into my head anyway. Yeah, it's hard. I think it's hard to say from the video that I saw exactly where the break is. So from that point, we're just speculating. But I think that is another viable option here, is that there was a bit of not user error on the part of Hofstetter, although I guess technically if you fell down twice, that's kind of user error. But potentially on the part of a mechanic there. Not to throw that mechanic under the bus, I don't know who that is.
Yeah, I mean, to your point, Eric, if you crash on carbon bars, you know, any of them can break. So I think user error in a race like Danone is a bit harsh on Hofstetter here, but I get your point. But it's also worth pointing out that Bianchi have said, and hear me out in this one, they've said that all these bars included and all their Bianchi products have passed the ISO 4210 standard, which to me, when I read that, I was like, really what I wanted them to be saying there is that they've gone above and beyond the ISO standard. Because as we've heard several times previously, is that standard might not really be up to this sort of, it might not be relevant enough for an incident like this, Hofstetter riding on cobbles or crashing on cobbles. And
then continuing.
Yeah, and that's sort of, okay, it passed the standard, and that's all it has to do. But for me, I would much prefer had they come out. I'd have much more confidence in it had they come out and said, "Look, we have taken this to ISO is." I think it's something like for handlebars, is it dropping a fixed weight once on the handlebar? That fixed weight is, I can't remember off the top of my head now anyway, but it is one fixed weight dropped on the handlebars once, if I remember correctly. And some brands are like repeating that fixed weight drop and lift up to thousands of times. So they're going above and beyond ISO standard that way. And that's, I think, had this, certainly a couple of brands I know had this happen to them, they'd be saying, look, we meet ISO, but we go beyond that. And had I heard that from Bianchi, I might have more confidence in this right now.
Yeah, I mean, the ISO test, a lot of that is to do with like fatigue testing as well. What we're looking at here, though, is the crash actually, I guess, puts an impact where it's effectively shearing the handlebar in towards the bike, and that's not a failure mode that I could be mistaken, and hopefully someone corrects me on this, but I don't believe that's part of the ISO test, that sort of failure mode, because it's not a directional force that you'd experience while riding the bike. And I think that's something that we've seen other handlebars fail in this regard before, and I think that's an important note to make, is that yes, the handlebar's gone through all these ISO tests, but what it hasn't gone through is a test that probably, someone stood on the handlebar, put the handlebar upright and then basically jumped on it and then put it back on the testing jig, because that is a crazy thing to do. But in reality, it's exactly the failure mode that has happened here. Yeah.
And speaking to someone who's done a lot of work in this area previously, on that very point there, Dave, was like, the ISO standard does not include, an impact like this. It doesn't have to, for handlebars, doesn't have to pass that. But what this person had told me was that if they do enough repetitions of the fatigue cycle, they can then extrapolate from that. Well, if it can take this much load this many times, it can take X amount more load in a once-off impact, which, I don't know, I prefer it just had an impact part of the test within the standard. But either way, I'm sure the Archaea riders are pretty nervous at the moment. If I think if any of them crash, they're going to be getting on spare bikes rather than assuming the bars on the bike that they crashed are fine, and then have them checked out that evening by the mechanic, take off the bar tape, get a proper look there.
Yeah. Before we move on, I think this is just, it's a good reminder that a lot of carbon components that are designed for racing aren't necessarily the most robust things after they've had an impact. And it's probably just a good reminder that if you do have a crash on a lightweight carbon bike, then it's important that you get it inspected, because these things are not designed to take a significant impact and then have a serviceable life after that.
So what? We don't really think that. What's the takeaway? The takeaway is if your bike falls down, in particular if you're riding on northern French cobbles at the time, check over your handlebars very carefully before riding again. And otherwise, we're not going to sit here and say that there's some horrible issue with these Bianchi bars. Is a relatively unique circumstance, but I think that's the primary takeaway. Just be careful with carbon bars.
Yeah, that's a different takeaway to what we just discussed. But Ronan, final thoughts.
Final thoughts for me are, basically just what for me it is a reminder that if you have an accident on a carbon handlebar, that you do need to check it, preferably before doing it. Like, even at the side of the road, if you look, your bar tape's badly cut up, it's really worth checking that there and then. As for the actual incident itself, I don't believe we're going to get any more information from Bianchi on this. I think they've made their statement. That's all they're going to say. But the statement didn't really. If I was an Archaea rider, the statement didn't do much to reassure me that there isn't an issue here.
Yeah, fair enough. All right, shall we move on?
Well, I was just going to say, in the interest of time efficiency, we could maybe do our PSA right now, which is also on handlebars, as we move out of winter in the Northern Hemisphere, and riders maybe take their bikes off the turbo trainers or indoor trainers or whatever, is just that a reminder that sweat is highly corrosive, can erode your alloy handlebars, and if that happens and you're not aware, your handlebars can break, much the same as we've seen with Hugo Hofstadter's this week, and the results can be nasty. So if your bike has been on the indoor trainer all winter, even if it hasn't, if it's been used on the trainer regularly through the winter and you've been sweating regularly through it, take off your handlebar tape, get a good look at it, check that it's okay. And the point that I mentioned earlier was that I actually, doing a sportif last August, about 80 mile into a 100 mile ride, I was alongside a rider whose handlebars broke because because they had been subject to a lot of sweat and corrosion over the previous winter. Worryingly, at the time, he said to me, "Oh yeah, I noticed that last summer and forgot about it. So this could have been avoided." But even more worrying was his insistence to keep riding for the final 20 mile with half a handlebar. My point to him was, if one side is broken, the chances are the other side is ready to go also, because they're probably both subject to the same amount of sweat. I don't know if that's true or not, but that was at least my way of trying to get him to to stay clear of me, because there's at least two descents with gradients in, you know, double digits coming up, and there was another climb again with gradients and the double digits coming up. So I didn't want them anywhere near me.
On that, I've noticed a few brands lately have sort of updated their manuals to basically suggest replacing your handlebar tape every 6 months to prevent, like, I guess, to ensure against this, that you're actually giving yourself a chance to check your handlebar for galvanic corrosion or other issues. So that's quite important to say, that if you are a heavy sweater, you know you're a heavy sweater, you know you do indoor cycling, you know you're bad with your bike maintenance in terms of washing it off. Then you should be you should be replacing your you should be replacing your bar tape more often, just purely out of the precaution of it. And also just don't ignore noises from your bike. Chances are those handlebars before they snap are starting to creak and make some kind of noise. And that's noises are typically your bike telling you something is wrong.
Or singing to you. One of the two. I want to move on to move on to Dirty Dave. Today's Dirty Dave is related to what we've sort of already teased and mentioned here. But we can't get started without hearing this week's Dirty Dave anthem.
Dirty dive, dirty dive, dirty dive.
Now, Dave, let's get into this somewhat massive story. I was it you that were saying that this is the biggest launch from any brand in quite some time, from a sort of like impact on the industry and how bikes might work and all the rest? Was that you saying that?
There's a friend / former boss, Mick Ross of Low Mountain Bike, was saying that, and I agree. Like it was basically saying it was the most coordinated product release he'd ever seen the bike industry do, and certainly from my point of view, I mean, this is years in the making. You could argue that the whole universal derailleur hanger standard that's become a standard within new mountain bikes, I mean, that was... I heard someone call it the Trojan horse of derailleur hangers. But it was like, you could argue that that existed with SRAM having a long-term goal of getting everyone to convert their frames over for this new derailleur. Yes.
So I want to unpack that a little bit, Dave. So explain what you mean for all the folks out there, what you mean by this universal derailleur hanger being a Trojan horse for what we saw
Not my
this
words.
morning. Not your words, but a fantastic way to describe it. And
I wanted to put it in my story, but it wasn't mine to use. So
explain yourself.
Yeah, so in 2019, SRAM introduced a derailleur hanger for manufacturers to adopt as a standard, and it was called the UDH. And basically what it was aiming to solve is, or what at the time everyone thought it was aiming to solve, was that there were hundreds of different derailleur hangers on the market. Every frame manufacturer had their own shape of derailleur hanger, which holds the derailleur. And every frame manufacturer has multiple shapes of these across basically every model of bike they release. They often bring out a new derailleur hanger. And it was a big problem for the industry, but it was also a big problem for drivetrain manufacturers such as SRAM, because the dimensions and the geometry of those derailleur hangers aren't always as consistent as they want. So in the case of their own derailleurs, they wanted to build in a little bit of protection from that derailleur hanger. They wanted it to pivot backwards in case it got an impact. And that's what one of the things the UDH managed to achieve, is if you actually hit the derailleur from the front, the whole hanger pivots backwards. The other thing they managed to do is build a little shelf in it. So if you don't adjust the derailleur correctly and it overshifts from your little 10-tooth cog, there's a little shelf that pops it back onto the 10-tooth cog. So the UDH solved all of these things, but most importantly and most impressively is that SRAM actually managed to get buy-in from basically everyone in the bike industry. And I'm struggling to think of any real known mountain bikes that came out since 2019 or since 2020 that haven't had this universal derailleur hanger mount fitted. But yeah, as we were saying, is it's the Trojan horse is that it's basically that interface that SRAM has managed everyone to adopt. You remove that universal derailleur hanger, and that is what allows you to then fit this new direct mount derailleur of theirs, which is sort of the basis of their entire new group set.
So if you have one of those sort of semi-recent bikes with the universal derailleur hanger, then you could upgrade to this new stuff at any time.
Correct. Yeah.
If you have a bike that is, and if you, it's as simple as that. There's no workaround.
No. So SRAM will continue doing their previous generation Eagle, which connects to a regular derailleur hanger. And yeah, if you've got an older bike, like for example my 2020 Ibis Ripley, which is in many ways still an excellent and modern bike, I can't fit this new SRAM gearing on that because it doesn't have a UDH.
Why did SRAM do this?
It's a good question. They basically are trying to solve the biggest issues and biggest downsides of derailleurs on mountain bikes. So the weakest points of a derailleur system on a mountain bike are one, the mechanic knowledge required to set one up correctly. And this definitely applied to Eagle, is that there was kind of you could read the manual, but then certain bikes still required an experienced mechanic to be able to tweak it even further, to really dial in the B gap adjustment, which is how far the top pulley sits away from the cassette, and also like your chain length might not be exact to the manual in some cases. There were these issues there that, yeah, I guess new consumers getting onto the bikes or mechanics with less experience might not be able to set up the derailleurs to be exactly as SRAM intended. So they sought to remove that from the equation. The other big thing is that 12-speed requires precision. It requires a stiff derailleur interface. It requires perfect alignment. So that derailleur hanger has to be perfectly aligned. That's something we've discussed before. And that was an issue. And that's something the UDH tried to solve by being a much stiffer interface. But there are ways to make it even better. And yeah, I think that's a key point, is that as we've gone to 12-speed, as we've gone to these massive range cassettes, I mean, this is a 10 to 52 cassette, there's a lot of forces on that derailleur hanger. There's a lot of forces on that derailleur as you shift. And yeah, that's something that this new design aims to solve, is that it actually can't bend. You can't straighten it either. There's no way to straighten it, but it can't bend.
Wasn't that the point of the hangers previously, though, that they would bend rather than... And I appreciate you've already gone on this in the article, but...
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this is absolutely like the most common question. It's the most obvious question, which is why there's an entire section dedicated to it in the article. But yeah, the question
which
is...
I have read. I've got that far.
So yeah, I mean, the question's pretty obvious. It's like, if the derailleur no longer has a derailleur hanger, the derailleur hanger previously used to be the sacrificial lamb. It used to be what would bend or break in order to save the derailleur, and most importantly, the frame. So without a derailleur hanger, surely something now has to break. And I guess from my point is, it would take the most ridiculous of impacts to break this thing. It is just so incredibly strong as a junction. So what you've got going on here is SRAM have got the derailleur itself is very overbuilt. It's all metal in this area. It's quite a lot of metal in the area. It's quite a heavy derailleur, and that is reinforcing this new dropout design that's probably thicker than dropouts we've seen in previous years. So the frame manufacturers are reinforcing this area as well. There's a lot of material there, but yeah, the derailleur basically sandwiches the dropout. So you've got reinforcement around the dropout, and then you've got this bolt that runs through the derailleur and through the dropout, reinforcing that connection, and then tying it all together is the rear through axle. So the rear through axle then slides into that dropout. So if you were to stand directly on the derailleur, it's perfectly rigid. You can kind of bounce up and down on it, and it doesn't really feel like it's flexing.
It's more like a crankset now. Right? Like,
yeah,
there's no built-in failure mechanism with your cranks if you hit your cranks too hard, right? Because the assumption is that the amount of force required to damage a frame by impacting a pedal, for example, is so high that it's not a problem. And that is essentially the same idea here, which is that I mean, if we step all the way back, like the original reason for this, I mean, Dave, you and I were racing mountain bikes in the late 90s and early 2000s. I used to go through like a couple derailleurs a season. One, because I was racing in Vermont and it was muddy and full of trees. And two, because derailleurs used to hang way out to the side and get clipped and broken all the time. And so as a result, you had to have some means of somebody in the comment section referred to it as a mechanical fuse, something that would just break off in an attempt to save your, at that point, they were like $200 derailleurs, not $700 derailleurs, but in an attempt to save your derailleur. Now, we kind of got to a point in the last couple of years, like I haven't broken a derailleur in, knock on wood here, in 4 or 5 seasons now, and I ride in a place that is even nastier from a derailleur killing perspective. It's full of rocks and full of sand, all sorts of stuff.
Because they're more tucked in than they ever used to be.
Because they're way more tucked in than they were before. And so then we get to this point where we started, like I always went and found derailleur hangers that were stiffer than stock because it made everything shift a lot better. And this is kind of just another step beyond that, which is, okay, we've tucked the derailleurs in. They're a lot less likely to get hit in the first place. And they've essentially strengthened all of the mounting area behind it so that it's more like a crank's not a perfect analogy because you've got a whole bunch of like bottom bracket section stuff down there. But I think that's the idea is like,
it's a good analogy. Yeah. For me, the material, like I can't emphasize how much material is in this area now. Where the derailleur connects to the frame, you've got probably like a combined 15 mil of solid material, just all being held together by that through axle. And if you were to take a direct strike to that edge of the derailleur, the through axle is holding it all rigidly together. So it's not like that part of the dropout is just going to flex and snap out of the frame. I'm really struggling to think of what would require to actually cause damage to the frame in this scenario. I think it would be the most
you will see photos of it.
I don't doubt it, but I'm going to liken it to the sort of failures we see at World Cup downhill races where, you know, someone's hit a tree at 50 kilometers per hour and the front triangle of the frame has completely sheared off. I think it's going to require that sort of failure mode to actually see an issue. Riding along and smacking your derailleur on a rock at 40k an hour, I don't think is going to phase the system.
Is everything else as standard? Like, do you need a different 3-axle, or how's wheel compatibility? Is all that just?
Yeah, so that remains. That was kind of what the UDH addressed. So it's all 12 mil through axle. They're all using the same axle pitch. So the UDH had standardized that. They'd standardized the chain line already. So nothing really brand new in that regard. Same wheels, even the same free hub body as before. Same bottom bracket as before. It's still their dub spindle. But yeah, what's new is like there's a new chain, there's a new cassette. We won't get into that because there's an article for that. But yeah, there is obviously a lot of new stuff, and it is the same Axis wireless protocol, so you can still use all the old shifters. You can mix and match it to like road shifters. You can use the old mountain bike shifter and vice versa. So
what we're going to have to get into, I assume, is the price of this stuff. $160 chain.
So
$600 cassette.
Yeah, so
it's criminal.
It's $100 as
That's ridiculous.
As a group set. It's $100 less than previous Eagle Axis. But I think what's important from my point of view is that the wear components have gone up in price. So the cassette and the chain have noticeably jumped up in price. Potentially they're more durable than before. So maybe it might play out in balance, but yeah, I mean, we're talking like, I think it was like $600 for the top end cassette and $150 for the top end chain. I mean, that is a lot of money for a component that wears out.
How do you justify that with a chain? Like they didn't fundamentally redesign the chain. It's still just a chain.
Yeah,
it can't possibly cost them that much more to produce.
And the rumor I heard, I haven't confirmed this SRAM, but I think their other chains are going to go up in price to be more aligned to this. I guess in SRAM's defense, their chains are the most durable on the market. And you combine it with like a good wax lube and you're getting 10,000 plus kilometers out of these chains, but still.
This is like, you ever go to buy a new iPhone cable from like the actual Apple store and they're like $45 for a thing that you can find elsewhere, particularly like off brand for like $1.50.
Have you used a $1.50 cable though, Caley?
But it's not that much worse. I can buy 40 of them for the price of one of the Apple ones.
You'll probably use the 40 of them.
But this is a known thing with companies like Apple where they jack up the prices of these essentially consumables. with a phone, it's maybe not consumable. You're going to lose it somewhere or whatever. But things that they know you're going to have to buy numerous times, they get amazing margins on them.
It's the personal printer syndrome, isn't it? Where the printer's basically free, you're paying for the cartridges.
Yeah,
it's almost almost that,
I don't know.
But not quite. Yeah,
I don't recall did you ask Lockie about this in particular? I don't recall in the deep dive. It's something I would like to ask SRAM, and I don't want to sit here and just like accuse them of jacking up the price on chains just to eke out a couple extra bucks. But I would like to hear an explanation for why a chain that is just a chain with slightly different shape is suddenly, like, chains used to be $25.
Yeah, but
that's an insane increase in cost.
I'm gonna defend SRAM here just purely on my own opinion, but chains that used to be $25 used to only also last 1,000 kilometers on a mountain bike if you're lucky. They're very different material makeup. They're very different construction. This $150 chain is hollowed out through the pins. It's hollowed out in the plates. Is there
a cheaper version?
They go down to $100 for the cheapest version, and that's still a high end chain.
I struggle to think of things I care about less than whether my chain is hollow.
But the grams, Caley, the grams. But yeah, I think the main thing here is that they are using whatever construction method they're using is incredibly durable as far as chains go. And we're also seeing the same from the likes of Shimano and Campagnolo, where their top end chains for these new 12-speed variants, which are very narrow, so they need to be incredibly strong for the amount of material there. They've all gone up in price quite a bit, and a chain is quite expensive these days. But I think, the main thing to keep in mind here is that we're not talking about a chain that's designed to last 1,000 kilometers anymore. We're talking about a chain that, if you take care of it off-road, could probably withstand as much as 10,000 kilometers of use. So for many people, that might be the only chain they ever need to buy if they choose to clean it and use a good lube on it. If you don't use a good lube on it, then, you deserve to buy new chains at $150.
That's victim blaming, Dave.
The other thing you could do, if you ride a lot more than that, every time you buy one of these, you could save the offcuts, and then if you've got a short enough chain stay and the right, you could upcycle.
You need to start with a 126 link chain on this new drivetrain. So
because we're going to have 13, 14 speed drivetrains by the time you'd actually get enough of them, I think. Yeah, I don't know. We've talked about this so many times. This like $150 chain is.
Oh, I'm not saying that's a good thing. I'm just saying I think it is worth keeping in mind just the durability associated with that price. It's also worth keeping in mind that there's chain lubes that that you should be using now because your chain's $150.
Agreed. What I will say though is, as the only one of the three of us that doesn't do any mountain biking, I so want to get into it because as the tech nerd that I am, it's just everything about this review you've written, Dave, and everything just about all the conversation you guys had last week. I effectively become a listener to this podcast when you start talking about my bike. But as a tech geek, and being a gadgety kind of person, I'm always going to want to come in right at the very top end. And if I don't, I'm always going to be looking at what else could I upgrade to. And when I see these sorts of things, it's just like, yeah, maybe mountain biking's not for me.
I think it's worth talking about sort of what is coming on the drop bar side a little bit, because a lot of our audience is probably more into that sort of thing at the moment. Because in recent years, I would say most major technological shifts have come from mountain bikes first. The exception being essentially like aerodynamic tweaks, right? But any sort of like major structural
tubeless,
changes,
disc brakes.
And the biggest one is disc brakes,
wider
right?
range gearing,
which has also led to, disc brakes. You can draw a straight line from disc brakes to Wout van Aert's bike at Milan-San Remo, right? Like most of the things that were on that bike, the 1x, the big wide 30 mil tires and huge wide rims and all these things, like all that stuff starts with the decision to take rim brakes off of road bikes. Anyway, so my point being is that this is a recurring theme, and it's worth talking about where this is going. So are we going to have what's the direct mount isn't even the term. Like, what's the term for? What's the term?
They've got their own term. I didn't use it in my story.
They're using the word transmission, which I refuse to use.
Yeah, they're calling it a transmission, whereas the old Eagle thing was called a drivetrain. That's just how they're separating it, rather than going through the trouble of coming up with a whole new name for this stuff.
I will continue to call it a drivetrain. But what is this? What is the derailleur mount?
That's the word I didn't use. They do have a specific word for it, which I'm sounding quite foolish now, having written 6,000 words, and I don't even know what they call it. But yeah, I mean, I'm just calling it a direct mount interface. That's something people are actually going to remember. But yeah, for me, I think there's too much tangible benefit here on offer for SRAM not to be thinking already about pushing this into the drop bar space. And there are some drop bar bikes that have the UDH, the new MB Mog and the new YT Sepster gravel bikes can actually use this new drivetrain. I'm sure there will be more that come to allow that sort of mullet group. But I think in the road, like there's actual aerodynamic benefits. There's post crash benefits here. I think from a performance point of view, I actually can't see why SRAM wouldn't be pushing for a road version of the universal derailleur hanger to come out.
What's Shimano doing?
That's a good question, because that's something I touched on in the article, is that SRAM have been very dominant in the mountain bike space, and they have the pull to make these changes in the mountain bike space. They have the pull to get the whole industry to adopt this universal derailleur hanger. They're not as dominant in the road space. Shimano still owns that road space, and I think that might be the answer, is potentially the industry will go with whatever Shimano's doing versus what SRAM's doing in this space. It's an interesting one. But yeah, both brands, Shimano were working on direct mount hangers well before SRAM released theirs. Shimano's go back to like 2013, where they were first playing with the idea. They've been pushing them since. Even current Durace, in theory, uses a direct mount hanger interface. The difference is that SRAM's requires the frame manufacturer to adopt to it, whereas Shimano's really just is a different shaped hanger.
And what is it that the frames, is it wider at the drop, or what's the difference that they need manufacturers to adopt there?
It's the shape of the hanger, basically. It's not necessarily, it's a little bit wider because the derailleur hanger was quite thick. It was actually made of it was actually plastic, the derailleur hanger on a UDH. That's the main thing, is it is probably a little bit thicker than a lot of the dropouts currently being used. And it does add a little bit of width in that regard. But yeah, it's realistically, it's a shape adoption. I do think they'll need to do a road version of the universal derailleur hanger in order for it to be adopted in the drop bar space.
If they did do a road version of the UDH, that then would be compatible with the other two grip sets or any other derailleur, but could also potentially be compatible if they bring, and the name I'm going to use for it is the sandwich mount. If they bring the sandwich mount to road.
I think I would imagine if they brought it to road, they'd probably have yet another whole new derailleur sizing.
Sorry, when I say road, sorry, I mean drop bar. Sorry.
Yeah, so I think that's already happening. So gravel bikes are adopting this mountain bike style UDH. We are seeing that already, and I think that'll become more common to allow this mountain bike derailleur to be fitted. And keeping in mind, it's with that UDH fitted, it's backwards compatible to every other. It's with the UDH derailleur hanger fitted, it's just a derailleur hanger, so you can fit every other derailleur still on that bike. But yeah, I think if we were to see it in the true road space, I think it'll be yet another system.
Oh, good.
But we'll see. We'll see, right?
Yeah. We didn't even talk about I guess we kind of talked about why. The real why is just it's so much stiffer that you can shift.
Yeah.
Under crazy loads and all sorts of
the
things.
real why behind this is because of e-bikes. Fundamentally, right? Like e-bikes have changed the game in that the consumer now expects to be able to shift under 600 watts or more. With no backing off the power. There's no more technique in shifting. So that's why Shimano had Hyperglide Plus 12 speed, which is designed for shifting under power. And realistically, this is SRAM's answer to that, is it's a drivetrain that you can just put all your weight through the pedals and shift, and it'll be fine. And it'll actually feel quite good doing it. And that's all driven by e-bikes. And e-bikes also, they're heavy. So if you get a little sideways in a corner and you hit the derailleur against a rock on an e-bike, there's 30 kilos of bike pushing against that derailleur plus you. It's just a lot heavier on components than mountain biking ever was in the past. And yeah, that's all this is it's designed to be robust enough for e-bike usage. And I think regular analog bikes benefit from it too.
Well, if that half-hour conversation wasn't enough for you, there's 6,000 words waiting for you at escapecollective.cc. As a reminder, Rome gets to write 6,000-word treatises on new stuff because of our members. So if you're not a member and you're reading such things, and you're listening to this podcast, you are a freeloader, and you should maybe heavily consider your choices in life. No, that's a little rude. That was a hard sell right there. No, seriously. Sign up if you can. We really appreciate it. And yeah, thanks, Dave, for spending all the time. How long have you been on this stuff? I forgot to ask.
I got it a bit over a month ago, I think. So yeah, it's been a little while. I haven't had the distance that I want on it, so I haven't been able to really judge, say, cassette wear. But yeah, I've got a few hundred off-road Ks on it and been completely flawless to date. A few hundred off-road Ks on it, plus hitting it with a hammer lots and trying to smack it into trees and stuff as I ride.
There's a video on the Escape Instagram if you want to see Dave hit it with a hammer. I, of course, as the hammer, am getting tagged in this video over and over again. So I appreciate that from everybody. This is just a total aside, but I appreciate SRAM getting this stuff to media early, right? And they got it to you before we even fully announced.
Yeah, I actually got it to it. I got to it a bit late compared to some others, but at the same time, that also meant I got the fanciest and nicest version of it, which others didn't get.
There you go. Yeah. There you go. Lucky you, Dave. Anyway, I like that. I like that as a trend, right? Yeah. Because what would have happened not that long ago was you would have been flown to somewhere, some island, probably off of Europe somewhere.
Yeah.
And you would have been given like 36 hours to ride this stuff on a bike you didn't know, in trails you didn't know, and you would have been asked to then write a some sort of first ride review / launch story.
Yeah.
Everything would be under embargo, so it would give you a couple days to turn it around, which, that was at least when I first started doing this in 2010, sometimes the stuff wasn't even under embargo. So you go ride the thing. You basically had to decide, do I want to ride this for an extra 2 hours and actually get an opinion of it? Or do I go back and essentially beat the rest of the competition to getting a story up? Just completely perverse incentives, right? Like talk about the best. Let's try to come up with the best way for these stories to be absolute useless garbage. Well, that's how you would do it. Thankfully, we moved on from that. Yeah. But this is another good step. Yeah. So kudos to SRAM for
and it was
getting you stuff early.
Yeah, and I got to put it onto my own bike. So, I got to keep that controlled. Yeah, it was just really well done.
It's huge.
Yeah.
Really, really well done on SRAM's part. We pull back the curtain on a fair number of things on this podcast. And I think that's one of them that we should probably do more often. So like how the media sausage is made, because how brands sort of treat these things has a material impact on the quality of the story that we can provide for all of you out there. The more time that Dave has on this thing, the better the piece that he's going to write. And so actually wasn't intended to be a plug here, but we're discussing internally kind of how to deal with launches where we don't get the stuff early, or basically times when something is handed to us and 36 hours later we have to write a story about it. And where we're landing at the moment, and for those of you who are members who are on the member Discord, I'd love feedback on this. But where we're landing at the moment is that I don't think we'll write much at embargo time unless we actually have had enough time to form an opinion, basically. That's kind of where we're at right now, because again, we don't need the page views that we perhaps needed in a previous life. We just need to make our audience happy. And so from that perspective, I think that's where we're kind of, that's where we're landing at this point in time, is that we're not going to review stuff with less than, we're not going to put a number on it, but a reasonable amount of time and distance on a product.
And a confident opinion. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I think the thing we can promise is that the traditional first ride review, that review that everyone seems to have from a press camp that comes out at the time of embargo, that's not something we're going to do.
Yeah.
You know, we might cover the release, but we'd probably hold our opinion until we can be confident in that opinion. And it's not going to be based on a single ride in a foreign place. That's for sure.
Yeah. Yeah. So maybe there's a story that goes up with just like a, pile of photos and some basic info, because that we can do, we can turn that around quite quickly. But we're just not going to do the day one first ride review thing. So, because it just doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense for us. It doesn't make any sense for the audience. It doesn't make any sense for that to exist. Just a useless piece of content, driven again by sort of the way that media has been forced to work for a very long time. So I don't know. Maybe we can affect some broader change on that front as well. So I didn't really intend to go on that tangent. We are
good tangent.
We're already an hour in, guys, and
I think people are happy to do a bit longer.
We've covered like a third of the things that we said we were going to talk about. So we're going to pick a couple more. This is going to be a slightly longer episode. I think that's fine. Let's get to something we've actually wanted to talk about for a couple episodes here, which is the industry glut, the overstock and clearance sales that are popping up. Dave, what's going on here?
Yeah, I mean, we know, we've been hearing about this. Anyone in the industry has been talking about it for a good probably 6 months now, that from the boom, we're going to see a little bit of doom. A lot of brands jumped on in terms of increasing their manufacturing capacity, their stock holds to meet demand. And a lot of that stock has arrived at a time when the demand has actually fallen back down, and people aren't spending as much on bikes, and people are now back in there, going back to the gym and back into a worse work-life balance. And the bike industry is feeling the effects. So in Australia, I've certainly been seeing a vast majority of our biggest retail chains having massive sales, like 40-50% off what you would think is popular stock. I've seen wholesalers trying to do direct-to-consumer sales to just try and move stock through. Cash flow is getting tough. And I guess this week what broke in the industry is that there's a bit of news of a very large liquidation from one of the UK's larger distributors, which is More Large. More is in a family name, MOORE. And yeah, they basically they're in liquidation at the moment, and the numbers are pretty staggering. I mean, they've got £35 million of stock value that has to be liquidated, and that includes, but is not limited to, 35,000 bikes that are going to be auctioned off for like pennies on the dollar.
That's going to really help the industry as well.
Yeah,
right?
Exactly. So basically, like, we're just in this downward spiral of the more, these sort of issues, the more these sales happen, the further the issues are just going to extend, because there's only so much of the stock you can actually move into the market. And what this is going to do is 35,000 bikes discounted is actually just going to further clog up the market for other distributors that are already struggling for cash and that are already struggling to move on stock. And unfortunately, I think the domino effect of this is going to be pretty severe over the next 12 months.
Yeah, there was a news piece that I seen last week, the week before. Silverfish, another UK distributor, had secured a round of investment just to sort of help them basically weather the storm at the moment. There's at least a couple of other distributors who are finding things tight at the moment. From what I understand, it's not necessarily at the moment a huge drop off in terms of demand. It's just the supply is where during the pandemic, where we needed supply within the industry and everybody wanted to buy a bike but couldn't get one, there was no supply. That has now flipped in that distributors, bike shops, everybody is sitting on huge amounts of stock. And although the demand is still up on where it was even pre-pandemic, it's not up enough to get these bikes moving quick enough and it's effectively just a cash flow problem.
Yeah, exactly. And I guess the worry here is that we're going to see a lot of independent bicycle dealers, so bike shops that are separate of brand ownership. They're going to struggle greatly through the next little while because the stock that they're sitting on, they need to move that out in order to survive. And unfortunately, I mean, that stock's just isn't moving. And a lot of them invested in a lot more stock than they'd previously had, say, back in 2019. So that's going to become a cash flow issue. That then flows directly onto the distributors who now can't get paid for the stock that they've handed out, often on, say, 60 to 90-day payment terms. So then they can't pay. Then those that gets passed on to the manufacturers. So basically the whole industry is going to struggle through this, but it's going to see some pretty significant consolidation of the industry, I think, over the next 12 months. Unfortunately, I also think, just going back to the independent bike shops, I think a lot of those are going to get snatched up at discounted prices by these big brands that still have some cash coming in and still have cash reserves. Unfortunately, those independent bike shops that sort of make the lifeblood of the bike industry that give us give us access to these small, hard to find products, give the community feel. I think a lot of them are going to go away and be replaced by these fairly generic brand owned bike shops.
I think the longer term or the independent bike shops who have been around for, 15, 20, 30 years and have that history there and potentially, are their own landlords. Those are maybe the independent shops who stand in the best position to be able to weather the storm. But even there, I think the word you use, consolidation, I think we're even going to see that across no matter what bike shop we're going to walk into for the foreseeable future. We're probably going to see a scenario where these shops are focusing on their core brands, and just the choice that we previously would have had is going to be greatly reduced. And that's
and this is a very dangerous time because, and this is a huge topic on itself, maybe we can return to this, but the more the retailers struggle to move the stock that they have, the more stock sits at the distributors and at the brand subsidiaries' warehouses. They have to move that stock. So if they can't move it through their regular retail channels, they are going to be forced to open up their own channels, which is exactly what we're seeing at the moment. We've seen Specialized do consumer direct sales of bikes they're overstocked in. We're seeing other brands do this. I think all of this is just going to push the bike industry to rapidly get into consumer direct channels. And again, that's just another threat for the independent bike dealer. But for me, that's kind of sad because it's going to be a compromise to product and it's going to be a compromise to service long term. And these bikes are very complicated these days and do need local service. You need hands-on service. And I don't think the industry is really that well equipped for what's about to happen.
Just one last thing on Moore Large before we move on is that it was they're actually a distributor that I had an account with when I worked with Sustrans, and they did a lot of. The reason we had the accounts there is because we were working in schools, and Moore Large did a lot of that end of the bicycle trade where, kids bike and lower end stuff, and if you needed helmets or you needed, just the sort of stuff that you would be using for kids or at the lower end of the price market,
family
price
bikes.
range. Yes, yeah. Exactly. I'm trying to find the right words there and just getting more and more lost. But anyway,
maybe like J and B for our US listeners. If you ever worked in a shop in the US, probably this is the closest analog there. You don't have J and B internationally, right? Anyway, yes, for our US listeners, that's a rough, probably equivalent.
And the point I was just going to make is that actually it's kind of an indication as well as just, with the global sort of cost of living crisis that's happening at the moment as well. It's the people who are tending to look towards those bikes that are also feeling the pinch most in this cost of living crisis, and hence are not going out to buy bikes. So while the higher end road bikes and racing bikes might still have demand there. Someone looking for a new bike for their kid who already has a bike, or someone looking for a £200 or £300 bike to get to work. While every bill that comes through the door is double what it was this time last year, that very quickly falls down the priority list, and that's it's there are other distributors who are working in that segment of the market also, and they're, as we said earlier about consolidation, like it's the point I'm trying to get to is that unfortunately Moore Large might not be the last for
No, I don't think they will be. And theirs is particularly bad timing, should I say, because they just went through a buyout last year. The business got sold from family ownership off to a new board of directors and new ownership, and obviously that didn't work out. But I think, the key thing here is that the highest end of the market, the top end road bikes, top end mountain bikes, there's always going to be demand for that because that level of income is just less affected through financial crises and general issues in the economy. And that market is actually still seeing some supply issues as a result of that. New Dura-Ace bikes, for example, are still kind of trickling through at a slower rate than the demand is right now. But it's everything else in the bike industry. It's the family market, it's the commuter market, it's the bread and butter to the industry, and where the majority of sales happen, that is what is all slowed down to the point that stock is now just stale, basically. Like the shops can't move it, the distributors can't move it, and that is the stuff where all these distributors are very heavily invested in and are going to struggle.
Bad news.
Moore Large actually did a heck of a lot just before Christmas, actually, to try and move a lot of the stock, and I actually moved a lot of it from what I hear, but it just the depth of the situation, it just wasn't enough apparently.
No, I mean, being left with 35,000 bikes, I mean, if you can imagine, even if they potentially moved as much as half their stock, I mean, that is a huge figure to overcome, and all of that is fundamentally, I mean, what we're talking about is greed, right? Like there was this huge boom from COVID, and all these distributors were like, okay, we've got 400% increase in demand. Let's capitalize on that. Let's get stock to meet that demand. And because of the timeline of all this, that stock arrived after the demand. And I think that's fundamentally what's happened here is the brands and the retailers and the distributors who were, I guess, we're smart enough to know that these booms are short term and that it's cyclical and that it's happened in the industry before, that it comes and goes, and they are adverse to substantial growth. They're the ones that are going to be fine. So Shimano, for example, they didn't grow at the rate that they were being demanded to, and people are angry with them at that. But
Shimano is a perfect example.
Yeah, Shimano's a perfect example. They're like, oh, if anything, I think it was something like anything more than 5% growth in a year is considered a liability to them. So they just stuck to their guns. They expanded production a little bit, but not to the extent that everyone else did. And I think those businesses are perfectly fine now, right? They're like, great, we're in a perfect position. We haven't overcommitted ourselves. It's the other brands that try to capitalize on the potential growth. That's where we're seeing the issue. And unfortunately, the ones that could have become winners are unfortunately the ones that are going to be the losers.
Well, on that somber note, I think it's time for us to wrap up for the day. We're going to skip On Our Minds and Over the Heads of Our Family today because we've had enough yammering in the last hour and 15 minutes. Please go sign up to escapecollective.cc. We really appreciate it. I think you'll appreciate it. I think you'll like what we're doing. We've only just barely gotten started, and there's already some amazing stuff up on the site. And yeah, I think you'll really enjoy it, all you folks out there. So go check it out. Go sign up, and we'll be back next week with another Geek Warning.
That's an important point there. I don't think you've actually... This is our first episode since the site actually went live. And I don't think we've said at any point that the site is actually up there now. If you want to go and look at it, escapecollective.cc. Probably should have put that at the start, shouldn't we?
They'll figure it out. Alrighty. Like I said, we'll be back next week. Thanks for listening, everybody. Bye-bye.